Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Strategic Watch. Today's story takes us deep into the heart of international geopolitics. And trust me, this one has shocked even Washington. A summit in Alaska, meant to display US power and control, has instead turned into a diplomatic minefield. And at the center of it all, not Washington, not Moscow, but Kiev. Yes, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has managed to hijack the narrative, leaving both Russia and the United States scrambling. So what really happened? How did Alaska become a turning point in the global struggle over Ukraine? And what does this mean for the future of world politics? Let's break it all down. When the Alaska summit was first announced, it carried with it the weight of history. This wasn't just another diplomatic meeting. It was a stage carefully designed for symbolism, for optics, and for the projection of power. For Moscow, this was supposed to be Vladimir Putin's moment to showcase resilience, to stand shoulder to shoulder with global powers and prove that, despite years of sanctions, international isolation, and the ongoing war in Ukraine, Russia was still a key player in shaping the future of world politics. The choice of Alaska itself is worth analyzing. Alaska is not only a US state with deep symbolic value, once sold by Russia to America in 1867, but also a location that represents both rivalry and unfinished history. Holding a summit, there was a statement in itself. Russia returning to a place tied to its imperial past, but now meeting as an equal with American leadership. For the Kremlin, the optics were priceless. Imagine the headlines: Putin on US soil, shaking hands, smiling for cameras, and projecting confidence to a domestic audience hungry for reassurance. Moscow's strategy here was twofold. First, to demonstrate to the world that Russia is not isolated, that Washington still has to talk to Moscow despite the war. Second, to send a message back home that Putin is respected abroad, that the sacrifices Russians endure in Ukraine are not in vain, and that their leader commands international attention. This summit was crafted as a carefully staged theater of power, a chance to rewrite the narrative of Russia as a cornered aggressor into one of Russia as a global negotiator. But the brilliance of political theater often hides fragility. A stage, no matter how grand, can collapse if the foundation is weak. The Alaska summit carried inherent risks for Moscow. By stepping into such a symbolic arena, Putin placed himself under the global spotlight and under intense scrutiny. Every gesture, every statement, every handshake would be analyzed not only by allies but by adversaries waiting for cracks to appear. And this is where the gamble lay. For Putin, Alaska was not just about diplomacy, it was about perception. Could Russia prove to the world that it still mattered? Could Putin show his people that he remained untouchable? Could Moscow reshape its image from an isolated belligerent into a recognized global force? Those were the questions on which the entire summit balanced. At first glance, the optics seemed favorable. Russian state media framed Alaska as proof that Moscow could not be ignored, that America was still forced to negotiate. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Because even before the summit began, there was a looming shadow, one that would ultimately turn Alaska from a stage of triumph into a field of traps. That shadow was Volodymyr Zelensky, and his defiant stance waiting just beyond the spotlight. As the spotlight fell on Alaska, where Russia and the United States were expected to shape the future of the ongoing conflict, many assumed Ukraine would simply be a bystander. But Volodymyr Zelensky had no intention of being sidelined. Instead, he executed a move that shocked observers, a direct and public rejection of any compromise that would weaken Ukraine's sovereignty. This was not a carefully balanced statement designed for polite diplomacy. It was blunt, uncompromising, and calculated to make headlines. Zelensky declared that Ukraine would not trade land for peace, would not recognize Russian claims, and would not bow to external pressure, no matter what was discussed in Alaska. By doing so, Zelensky effectively disarmed the Alaska summit before it could even begin. Putin may have been aiming for a photo op, hoping to return home with evidence of recognition, but Zelensky's words stripped away the meaning of that moment. Any deal or handshake in Alaska became hollow the instant Kyiv refused to acknowledge it. Analysts describe this tactic as a textbook example of strategic denial. Rather than confronting Russia militarily on the diplomatic stage, something impossible when Ukraine was not even present, Zelensky turned to narrative warfare. He ensured that Russia could not declare victory because the legitimacy of such a victory depended on Ukraine's consent. By refusing that consent, he transformed Putin's carefully staged theater into an arena filled with invisible traps. This is why commentators describe the summit as a minefield. For Moscow, every step forward, every claim of progress, every gesture of strength, was countered by Kyiv's defiance. Instead of reinforcing Russia's power, the summit risked exposing its weakness, that even on the world stage, Putin could not bend Ukraine to his will. But Zelensky's counter-move did more than just frustrate Moscow. It also complicated matters for Washington. American leaders wanted Alaska to project stability, a sense that negotiations were possible and peace was within reach. Zelensky's declaration shattered that illusion. Suddenly, Alaska looked less like a neutral ground for progress and more like a contested battlefield, one where words carried the weight of bombs. Zelensky's timing was deliberate. By making his stance known as the summit unfolded, he hijacked the global narrative. News outlets that might have focused solely on the optics of Putin standing with US leaders instead shifted their headlines: Ukraine rejects concessions, Ukraine refuses compromise, Ukraine holds the line. The story was no longer about Moscow's strength, but about Kyiv's resilience. For Russia, this was devastating. Putin wanted to prove to his people that the world respected him, that Russia was unbreakable. Instead, the only message heard globally was that Ukraine would not yield. What was designed as a demonstration of power for Moscow became a display of resistance for Kyiv. In a single act of defiance, Zelensky not only undermined the Alaska summit, but also elevated Ukraine's voice on the world stage. He turned absence into presence, silence into disruption, and Alaska, intended as Moscow's stage, into a minefield of narratives that left Russia cornered. In the unfolding drama of global power plays, one thing became startlingly clear. Even the United States, with its vast intelligence networks and diplomatic machinery, was blindsided by Zelensky's sudden strike of words. Washington had entered the Alaska talks with confidence, expecting the spotlight to shine on their role as the ultimate power broker. What they didn't anticipate was that Ukraine, thousands of miles away, would seize control of the narrative without ever stepping foot on Alaskan soil. American officials were stunned. The US agenda for Alaska had been carefully laid out to project unity, signal strength against Russia, and quietly hint at pathways for eventual de-escalation. The presence of Putin was expected to be controversial but manageable, the kind of high-stakes diplomatic theater Washington thrives on. Yet Zelensky's statement, delivered with uncompromising resolve, shattered the stage props before the performance even began. Here was the uncomfortable truth: while Washington wanted to showcase its ability to contain and manage Moscow, it had underestimated the defiance of its own ally. Ukraine's voice was not only louder but sharper. By rejecting concessions outright, Zelensky forced Washington into a corner. Any gesture of flexibility toward Russia now looked like betrayal. Any softening of tone could be read as ignoring Ukraine's sacrifice. In other words, Zelensky's words handcuffed US diplomacy. Analysts in Washington scrambled to spin the moment. Some argued Zelensky was simply posturing for domestic audiences. Others claimed it was a negotiation tactic meant to strengthen Ukraine's bargaining position. But behind closed doors, frustration grew. US leaders had not planned for this level of resistance, especially in a setting they controlled. The summit in Alaska, intended to be an American stage for power projection, had unexpectedly been hijacked by Kyiv's defiance. And then came the ripple effect. News outlets across the globe quickly reframed the narrative. What had been touted as a critical US-Russia summit in Alaska suddenly became Ukraine undermines Moscow's ambitions in Alaska. For the Biden administration, this was a nightmare scenario. The US wasn't the central player in the story anymore. Instead, it was a secondary character, caught between Russia's demands and Ukraine's defiance. This shift revealed something deeper about Washington's predicament. For decades, the US had shaped conflicts through control of the narrative, presenting itself as the indispensable actor in global disputes. But Zelensky, through a single act of verbal defiance, disrupted that monopoly. He reminded the world that the war wasn't America's story to write, it was Ukraine's. The surprise in Washington wasn't just about being caught off guard. It was about being reminded that even the greatest superpower can be overshadowed when smaller nations take bold, uncompromising stands. In a way, Zelensky had done what few leaders manage. He had forced the United States to react, rather than dictate. For the US, this was a jarring moment. Alaska was supposed to showcase American control. Instead, it revealed vulnerability. A reminder that even the strongest nation cannot script every scene of the global stage. Not when allies find their voice and turn the spotlight in a different direction. The Alaska shockwave did not stop at Washington or Moscow. It reverberated across every corner of the globe. In the aftermath of Zelensky's fiery defiance, governments, analysts, and media outlets scrambled to make sense of what had just unfolded. The summit that was supposed to project US dominance instead became a stage for Ukraine's uncompromising stand, and the fallout was immediate, dramatic, and far-reaching. Europe's divide in Europe, reactions were split. Eastern European nations, Poland, the Baltic states, and even Romania, hailed Zelensky as a hero. To them, his statement was not reckless but necessary. They argued that only an unshakable stance could stop Russian expansion. Polish media framed the Alaska moment as the loudest warning to Moscow yet. In the Baltics, leaders praised Zelensky for articulating what they had long felt: no compromise, no half measures, no appeasement. But in Western Europe, unease grew. Germany and France, already wary of endless escalation, worried that Zelensky's rhetoric would corner the West into an unwinnable conflict. "He has thrown fuel into a fire that desperately needed water," remarked one German diplomat anonymously. For Paris, the Alaska shock was a reminder that Europe's voice in the conflict was shrinking. Overshadowed by a direct Kyiv-Moscow-Washington triangle, China's strategic advantage in Beijing, the Alaska moment was quietly celebrated. China saw opportunity in the chaos by watching the US stumble and Ukraine seize the spotlight. Beijing calculated that America's grip on its allies was weakening. State media painted Washington as a superpower losing control, unable to dictate outcomes even at its own summit. For China, which has long aimed to project itself as an alternative global leader, Zelensky's defiance was proof that US hegemony was cracking. India's calculated silence. India, meanwhile, stayed cautious. Publicly, New Delhi avoided commenting directly, but behind the scenes, analysts noted an important trend. India saw Alaska as a warning of overdependence on Western alliances. If Washington could be blindsided by Kyiv, could New Delhi truly trust the US to balance its own delicate ties with Russia? Alaska became a case study in the limits of American control, reinforcing India's instinct to chart an independent, non-aligned course. The Global South speaks in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Zelensky's defiance struck a different chord. Leaders saw it as a symbol of resistance, not just against Moscow, but against great powers in general. "If Ukraine can speak against both Russia and the United States, why can't we?" asked a commentator in South Africa. In Latin America, talk shows buzzed with comparisons to their own struggles against foreign influence. Alaska, strangely enough, ignited a sense of empowerment among smaller nations. Media frenzy. Global media seized the drama. Headlines weren't about Biden or Putin, they were about Zelensky's bold interruption of the diplomatic script. Phrases like Alaska Minefield and Zelensky hijack summit dominated front pages. For once, it wasn't the military battlefield in Ukraine commanding attention, but the symbolic battlefield in Alaska. This mattered deeply. Wars are fought not just with tanks and missiles, but with perception. And in Alaska, Ukraine won the perception war. By rejecting compromise outright, Zelensky reframed the conflict not as a manageable crisis, but as a moral standoff: freedom versus aggression, survival versus appeasement. The larger lesson: the Alaska fallout revealed something crucial about today's world. Smaller nations, when resolute, can redirect the currents of geopolitics. Zelensky's statement forced the great powers, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, to react, not dictate. That inversion of power was rare, almost historic. And so, the world watched, some cheering, some worrying, others calculating their next move. But one truth was undeniable: Alaska had become more than a summit. It had become a minefield, not of bombs, but of narratives. Narratives that could reshape alliances, challenge superpowers, and redefine the rules of the 21st century. When the dust of Alaska finally settled, one question hung heavy over the global stage: what comes next? The world had just witnessed an extraordinary disruption. A summit designed to showcase US power instead became a stage for Ukraine's defiance. Moscow was angered, Washington was unsettled, and the world was left to wonder whether Alaska marked the beginning of a new chapter in the conflict or the unraveling of global stability itself. For Russia, the Alaska incident was nothing short of humiliation. Putin entered the talks hoping to exploit cracks in Western unity, to pressure Washington into nudging Ukraine toward concessions. Instead, Zelensky's words exposed Moscow's isolation. Russia now faces a stark dilemma: double down on aggression to prove its strength, or recalibrate its strategy to avoid appearing weakened on the global stage. Either path is fraught with risk. Escalation risks further sanctions and isolation, while compromise risks signaling defeat. For the United States, the challenge is equally daunting. Alaska revealed the limits of American control, a reminder that even its closest allies cannot be scripted. Washington must now decide: should it rein in Kyiv to preserve room for diplomacy, or should it embrace Ukraine's defiance and risk an even sharper confrontation with Moscow? Neither choice is comfortable, but one thing is certain: America can no longer ignore the independent agency of Ukraine. For Ukraine, Alaska was both a victory and a burden. Zelensky succeeded in dominating the narrative, proving that his nation's struggle cannot be sidelined. But with that defiance comes responsibility. By planting the rhetorical minefield in Alaska, Kyiv has left itself little room for retreat. The world now expects Ukraine to match its words with unbreakable resolve. A heavy weight for a nation already bleeding from war. And then there's the global stage. Alaska has set off tremors that will ripple for months, perhaps years. Europe is divided, China is watching eagerly, and the global south is emboldened. Smaller nations now see that the balance of power can be disrupted, that even at an American-hosted summit, the narrative can be stolen by those willing to speak without fear. This realization could reshape how future international gatherings unfold. But the most dangerous fallout lies in the realm of perception. Wars are not only fought with weapons but with stories. Alaska has reshaped the story, from a confrontation between great powers to a struggle where smaller nations can bend the arc of geopolitics. This change in perception may prove just as consequential as any battle fought on the ground in Ukraine. As the cameras turned off and delegations departed from Alaska, the air was heavy with uncertainty. No peace was secured, no compromise reached. Instead, a new question was etched into history: who truly controls the narrative of this war? Is it Washington, with its power and prestige? Is it Moscow, with its aggression and threats? Or is it Kiev, whose defiance has proven strong enough to rattle the foundations of global diplomacy? The answer is still unfolding, but one truth is undeniable. Alaska will be remembered not for what was agreed, but for what was revealed. That in today's volatile world, even the mightiest powers can be outmaneuvered by the will of those who refuse to bend. The minefield has been set, and the world is now forced to walk carefully across it. This is the Alaska moment, a moment that may change the course of the war and the balance of power in the 21st century. One speech, one act of defiance, and the world is left to navigate a minefield of uncertainty. Stay tuned with Strategic Watch as we continue to track these developments, decode the narratives, and bring you the sharpest insights into the battles shaping our world.